February 26, 1991, the Iraqi desert. The time is shortly after midnight. A heavy, suffocating darkness blankets the landscape, compounded by a brewing shamel, a violent windstorm that kicks up walls of sand and dust, reducing visibility to almost zero. Buried beneath the dunes, the Tawakkalna division of the Republican Guard waits. These are not conscripts. These are the elite, the hardened steel of the Iraqi military, trained in the rigid, mathematical doctrine of the Soviet Union. They are sitting inside the pride of the Eastern Bloc, T-72 tanks. Inside the commander's cupola of a lead T-72 tank, the air is thick with the smell of diesel oil and nervous sweat. The commander presses his eyes against the rubber eyepieces of his night vision scope. The world outside is a grainy, indistinct wash of green static. Soviet doctrine states that night is a time for repositioning or holding ground, not for complex maneuvering. The technology simply does not allow it. If they cannot see, the enemy cannot see either. That is the rule of warfare they have lived by for decades. They are dug in, their hulls are defiladed, covered by sandberms, leaving only their heavily armored turrets exposed. They are a fortress. According to the intelligence provided by their advisors and their own reconnaissance, the American forces are kilometers away, likely blinded by the same storm that is blinding them. They expect an artillery barrage at dawn. They expect the roar of jet engines. They expect a conventional fight. Then, the impossible happens. There is no sound of a jet engine. There is no telltale scream of incoming artillery shells. There is only a sudden, violent flash in the distance, followed instantly by the catastrophic detonation of the T-72 tank to the commander's left. The explosion is absolute. The 40-ton machine does not just catch fire, it disintegrates. The turret, weighing 12 tons on its own, is ripped from the chassis and thrown into the night sky like a discarded toy. The commander screams into his radio, demanding a status report. "Contact! Contact front!" But there is nothing to see. He slews his turret desperately, searching for the muzzle flash of an enemy tank. The M1 Abrams is the predator they fear, the heavy American beast. To kill a T-72 tank like that, it must be a main battle tank with a 120mm cannon. But the rhythm is wrong. Another explosion. Then another. The hits are coming in a rapid, terrifying staccato. Bam. 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 This is not the slow, methodical reloading cycle of a heavy tank. This is something else. The commander stares into the green abyss of his optics. There are no thermal signatures he can identify. No massive heat blooms of turbine engines. Just the wind, the sand, and the sudden surgical death of his platoon. "Where are they?" his gunner screams. "I have no target." A tracer round streaks out of the darkness, not the heavy, single shot of a tank gun, but a chain of light, buzzing like an angry hornet. It impacts the reactive armor of a BMP-2 infantry fighting vehicle nearby. The armor holds for a fraction of a second before a second projectile slams into the exact same spot. The vehicle erupts. The radio net dissolves into chaos. Reports are flooding in from the entire defensive line. Battalion commanders are shouting that they are under heavy fire from close range. But the distance reports are contradictory. Some say the fire is coming from 3,000 meters away, a distance impossible to shoot accurately in a sandstorm at night. Others swear the enemy is right on top of them. The Iraqi commander finally spots a ghost. Through a break in the dust, he sees a silhouette. It is boxy, tall, and absurdly quiet compared to a tank. It looks fragile. It doesn't look like a predator. It looks like a transport. He orders his gunner to fire. The T-72 tank's autoloader cycles, ramming a sabot round into the breach. They fire. The massive gun roars, shaking the chassis. The round flies into the dark. They wait for the explosion. They wait for the confirmable kill. Nothing. The American silhouette didn't move. It didn't explode. It simply wasn't there. Or perhaps they missed. Before they can reload, a streak of fire erupts from the transport vehicle. A wire-guided missile, riding an invisible beam, closes the distance in seconds. The last thing the Iraqi commander registers is the confusing shape of the enemy. It is too high, it is too small, it shouldn't be able to hurt him. Then the missile strikes the turret ring. The ammunition carousel beneath his feet detonates. The world goes white. This was the reality of the Battle of 73 Easting and the Battle of Medina Ridge. It was a slaughter that defied every calculation the Soviet military had made for 40 years. Welcome to Cold War Impact. In this series, we dissect the technology and the tactics that defined the global standoff. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden history of military dominance, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. The sun rises over the Iraqi desert on February 27, 1991. The storm has cleared. The scene that is revealed is one of total devastation. Scores of burning hulls litter the desert floor. T-72 tanks, T-55 tanks, and BMP vehicles are scattered like scrap metal. To the Soviet observers and military attachés who would later analyze the data, this battlefield was a crime scene that didn't make sense. The stakes here were not just about the liberation of Kuwait. This was the ultimate field test of Soviet military philosophy versus American technology. For decades, the Soviet Union had built its strategy around mass. They believed that quantity had a quality all its own. They built thousands of tanks rugged, simple, low profile, designed to swarm across the plains of Europe. They accepted that their optics were inferior, but they believed their numbers would overwhelm the high-tech, expensive American units. But looking at the wreckage in Iraq, that theory had evaporated. The reports reaching Baghdad and subsequently flowing back to Moscow intelligence circles were baffling. The Iraqi generals were trying to piece together what had destroyed their elite divisions. They looked at the entry holes in the armor. Many of the tanks had been destroyed by the M1 Abrams, the expected heavy hitter. But as they catalogued the damage, a disturbing pattern emerged. A massive percentage of the armored kills, far higher than anticipated, were not caused by the large sabot rounds of a main battle tank. They were caused by missiles, and not just missiles from attack helicopters. These were ground-based, wire-guided missiles fired from a platform that the Iraqis had dismissed. The Soviet advisors looked at the tactical maps. The engagement ranges were the primary source of their confusion. The reports indicated that Iraqi tanks were being engaged and destroyed from distances exceeding 3,500 meters at night through smoke and dust. The T-72 tank, the champion of the Soviet export market, had an effective night engagement range of perhaps 800 to 1,000 meters under those conditions. Its infrared searchlights were like shining a flashlight in a dark room. They gave away your position without letting you see far enough to shoot. So, the mystery deepened. The enemy was seeing through walls. The enemy was firing from beyond the horizon. But the most terrifying aspect for the Soviet analysts was the signature of the killer. Survivors described a vehicle that fired rapidly, like a machine gun, but punched holes like a cannon. They described a vehicle that launched 2 missiles in quick succession and then disappeared. This didn't fit the profile of the M1 Abrams. The Abrams was a brawler. This new threat was a sniper. In the corridors of the Kremlin, rapidly losing its grip on power as the Soviet Union collapsed, the military old guard watched the news coming out of the Gulf with a growing sense of dread. They weren't just watching an ally lose, they were watching their own reflection die. If the Americans possessed a weapon system that could neutralize their main battle tanks without even deploying their own heavy armor, the entire premise of the Red Army was flawed. The thousands of tanks sitting in depots in East Germany and Ukraine were suddenly transformed from a terrifying iron wave into sitting ducks. They needed to know what this thing was. Initial intercepts and battlefield rumors were wild. Was it a new type of low-flying drone? Was it a secret, lightweight tank the Americans had never publicly unveiled? The confusion was compounded by the speed of the American advance. The US 7 Corps was moving across the desert at a pace that should have been impossible for a mechanized army. They weren't stopping to refuel or regroup in the traditional sense. They were hunting on the move. The ghost that was killing the Republican Guard was leading the charge. It was out in front of the heavy tanks. It was aggressive. It was everywhere. To the Iraqi soldier shivering in his foxhole, this vehicle was a nightmare. It had a distinct, high-pitched whine to its engine, different from the deep rumble of the tanks. It was the sound of impending death. When they heard that whine, they knew they were already seen. They knew a missile was already in the air. But to the strategists, it was a mathematical impossibility. How do you armor a vehicle heavily enough to survive the front lines, yet make it fast enough to scout, and arm it heavily enough to kill a T-72 tank? In Soviet engineering, you could pick 2 of those 3 things. You could never have all 3. The T-72 tank was the answer to the iron triangle of speed, armor, and firepower. It sacrificed crew comfort and situational awareness for a low profile and a big gun. The Americans seemed to have broken the triangle. As the smoke cleared over the burning oil fields, the true scope of the disparity began to dawn on the observers. This wasn't a fight, it was an execution. And the executioner wasn't who they thought it was. The reports started filtering up to the highest levels of the Iraqi command. "The tanks are burning, but we don't see the enemy tanks." "Then what do you see?" the generals demanded. "We see troop carriers. We see taxi." The idea was laughable. A troop carrier is a box made of aluminum designed to ferry infantry to the fight and then hide. It is not a tank hunter, it is prey. If the Americans were sending troop carriers to fight T-72 tanks, they should be massacred. The 125mm gun of a T-72 tank should slice through an aluminum carrier like a hot knife through butter. And yet, the taxis were winning. This anomaly, the survival and lethality of a thin-skinned vehicle against heavy armor, became the focal point of the mystery. It suggested that the Americans had developed a technology that rendered armor thickness irrelevant. It suggested that the era of the tank might be over, killed by something smaller, faster, and smarter. For the Soviet generals, staring at the grainy satellite photos and reading the frantic transcripts from the Republican Guard, the question wasn't just, "How are we losing?" It was, "What is that thing?" It was a ghost in the desert, a machine that broke all the rules of engagement. And as the investigation into this disaster began, they would soon realize that their understanding of modern warfare was about to be rewritten by a vehicle they had spent the last decade underestimating. The dust had barely settled over the highway of death before the reports began to circulate in the dimly lit intelligence offices of the GRU in Moscow. The Soviet Union was crumbling from within, its economy in freefall, but its military apparatus remained a vast, pulsating brain that demanded answers. The disaster in Iraq was not just a geopolitical setback, it was a technical emergency. Field agents and military attachés stationed in the Middle East were tasked with a single urgent directive: explain the anomaly. They needed to understand how a Soviet-trained army, equipped with Soviet hardware that was supposed to be competitive, had been dismantled with such humiliating ease. The initial investigation focused on the wreckage. Soviet advisors, moving discreetly through the battlefields where they could, or analyzing detailed reconnaissance photos where they couldn't, began to catalogue the death of the T-72 tanks. What they found was confusing. Standard military logic dictated that in a tank battle, the primary killer should be another tank. The kinetic energy penetrators fired by the M1 Abrams left distinctive scars, brutal, high-velocity punctures that shattered armor through sheer force. And indeed, many Iraqi tanks bore these wounds. But there was a second, pervasive category of destruction that didn't fit. Hundreds of Iraqi vehicles, T-72 tanks, T-55 tanks, and BMP-1 carriers had been destroyed by shaped charges. These were small, precise holes, often accompanied by the catastrophic burnout of the vehicle's interior. The metal around the entry point wasn't shattered. It was melted, a jet of superplastic copper having burned its way through. This was the signature of an anti-tank guided missile, or ATGM. The Soviets knew the Americans used the Tau missile. It was a known quantity. It was a wire-guided weapon that had been around since the 1970s. But the sheer volume of Tau hits was mathematically irreconcilable with the American order of battle. There simply weren't enough specialized tank destroyer units to account for the carnage. The investigators turned to the human element. They interviewed the survivors, the Iraqi tank crews who had managed to bail out of their burning machines and retreat into the desert. Their testimony was frantic and consistent, but to the ears of a Soviet general, it sounded like hallucination. It wasn't the heavy tanks, a captured Iraqi major reportedly told his interrogators. It was the troop carriers, the little ones. The investigators showed them silhouettes. The Iraqis pointed to the M2 Bradley. This was the moment the investigation hit a wall of cognitive dissonance. The Soviet military establishment had a file on the M2 Bradley. They knew what it was. In their assessment, it was a compromised design, a jack of all trades, master of none. To the Soviet eye, the Bradley was absurd. It was huge, almost 3 meters tall. It had a high silhouette that made it impossible to hide in the flat terrain of the European plain or the Iraqi desert. It was clad in aluminum armor, which the Soviets considered inferior to steel. It carried a 25mm cannon, a pop gun, compared to the 100mm low-pressure guns on the Soviet BMP-3 vehicles. In the ruthless calculus of the Cold War, the Bradley was considered a bloated target. It was too heavy to swim across rivers easily, too tall to be stealthy, and too lightly armored to survive a direct hit. The Soviet nickname for their own BMP vehicles was sometimes Common Grave, due to their vulnerability. They assumed the American version was simply a larger, more expensive grave. So, how was this target destroying the best tanks the Soviet Union had ever exported? The investigation spiraled into a hunt for a phantom capability. The GRU analysts began to build a legend around the vehicle, driven by the paranoia that the Americans had hidden a secret weapon inside the chassis. One theory that gained traction was that the Americans were using a new, undetectable form of electronic warfare. The Iraqi gunners reported that their optics were useless. They couldn't see. Perhaps the Bradleys were projecting some kind of blinding laser or jamming signal? This would explain why the T-72 tanks, which should have had the range advantage with their big guns, were sitting ducks. Another theory was that the troop carrier guise was a lie. Perhaps the vehicles leading the charge weren't carrying troops at all. Maybe they were automated drone ships, packed entirely with missiles, guided by a master computer in the rear. The precision was too high for a terrified 19-year-old gunner in the heat of battle. The bogeyman grew. Intelligence reports noted that the Bradleys were engaging targets while moving at full speed. This was technically impossible for a wire-guided missile. To fire a Tau missile, the vehicle had to stop. The wire would break if you fired on the move. The shooter had to sit still, exposed, guiding the missile for the 10 to 20 seconds it took to reach the target. Yet, the Iraqis swore the Americans never stopped moving. They were swarming, firing and turning, a chaotic dance that left the rigid, static Iraqi formations paralyzed. The Soviet investigation focused heavily on the 25mm Bushmaster chain gun. They looked at the damage on the Iraqi optics. They found that even when the tanks weren't destroyed by missiles, they were blinded. The rapid-fire high-explosive rounds from the chain guns had shattered the periscopes and sights of the T-72 tanks before the tank commanders could even lay their guns on the target. This led to a terrifying realization. The Americans weren't fighting fair. They were using suppressive fire with a precision that acted like a sniper rifle. But the generals in Moscow, sitting under the portraits of Lenin, drew the wrong conclusions. They refused to believe that the vehicle itself was superior. It went against their doctrinal religion. They concluded that the failure was purely human. It was the Iraqis, they argued. The Iraqis were poorly trained. They lacked the fighting spirit of the Soviet soldier. They had abandoned their vehicles too early. They hadn't used the terrain. They concluded that the M2 Bradley's success was a fluke of the environment. It only works in the desert, they told themselves. In the forests of Germany, our T-80 tanks would crush them. They fixated on the armor thickness. They looked at the specs and said, a 14.5mm heavy machine gun can penetrate the side of a Bradley. It is a weak vehicle. They comforted themselves with the physics of armor penetration, ignoring the reality of the battlefield. They ignored the most critical piece of evidence. The American crews were seeing the enemy before the enemy saw them. There was a report, buried in the stack of intelligence, about a specific engagement where a platoon of Bradleys destroyed a company of T-72 tanks in pitch blackness through a sandstorm without suffering a single loss. The Iraqi survivors said the Americans picked them off one by one as if they were shooting at targets on a range. The Soviet analysts read this and marked it as exaggerated. They simply couldn't conceive of a sensor suite that could turn night into day with such clarity. They knew about infrared, but their own infrared systems were fuzzy, indistinct, and short-ranged. They assumed the Americans had the same limitations. So, the investigation chased its own tail. They hunted for a superweapon, a new missile, a laser, a jammer. They looked for a complex answer to a simple problem. They didn't realize that the magic wasn't a new type of explosive. It wasn't a laser. It was something far more mundane and far more devastating. While the Soviets argued about armor sloping and missile caliber, they missed the revolution. They were looking for a bigger hammer, while the Americans had brought a flashlight into a dungeon. The Soviet military complex convinced itself that the M2 Bradley was still a failure of design, a tall, clumsy target that had gotten lucky against an incompetent enemy. They filed the reports. They reassured the Politburo that the Red Army's equipment was still superior. They were wrong. And across the ocean, in a quiet office in San Jose, California, and a testing ground in Fort Benning, Georgia, the Americans knew exactly why the Soviets were confused. They had gambled everything on a concept that the Russians had dismissed as a luxury. The investigation in Moscow ended with a shrug. But the reality was sitting in the desert sand, humming with a quiet, lethal power. The Americans hadn't just built a better troop carrier. They had built a machine that fundamentally changed the relationship between man, machine, and the dark. While the Soviets were frantically analyzing armor slopes and chasing rumors of laser beams, the truth was sitting in a climate-controlled laboratory in Texas and a testing range in California. The ghost that had decimated the Republican Guard was not a new secret project. It was a vehicle that had been the subject of one of the most public, humiliating, and lengthy development disasters in Pentagon history. It was the M2 Bradley. For years, the American press, and even members of Congress, had mocked this machine. They called it a rolling coffin. They said it was too tall, too expensive, and too fragile. There were hearings where generals were grilled about why the US Army was buying a troop carrier that couldn't survive a hit from a Soviet anti-tank rocket. But hidden inside that controversy was a technological leap that the critics and the Soviets had completely misunderstood. The American solution wasn't about making the armor thicker, it was about making the vehicle smarter. In the late 1970s, American engineers at FMC Corporation and Hughes Aircraft were working on a problem that terrified NATO commanders: the Fulda Gap. They knew that if the Cold War went hot, thousands of Soviet tanks would swarm through Germany. The US could not match them tank for tank. The math didn't work. So, they decided to change the equation. They needed a vehicle that could see the enemy first. The secret weapon wasn't the missile, it wasn't the gun. It was a box of glass and sensors mounted on the right side of the turret, the Integrated Sight Unit, or ISU. Inside this box was the thermal imaging system. To the human eye, or to the standard optical sights used by Soviet T-72 tanks, a battlefield at night is a wall of black, smoke, dust, and camouflage netting make targets invisible. But to a thermal sensor, the world is a vivid landscape of heat. A tank engine glows white-hot. The friction of tracks on sand creates a heat signature. Even the body heat of a commander standing in a hatch shines like a beacon. While the Soviet designers were obsessing over night vision goggles that needed ambient light, starlight or moonlight to function, the Americans were perfecting a technology that didn't need light at all. It only needed temperature differences. This was the ghost capability. In the Iraqi desert, the sandstorm that blinded the T-72 tank crews was transparent to the Bradley's thermal sights. The dust particles blocked visible light, but the infrared heat waves from the Iraqi tanks passed right through. When the Iraqi commander in Part 1 was staring into green static, the American gunner in the Bradley was looking at a crisp, black and white television screen. He could see the Iraqi tank. He could see the gun barrel. He could see the exhaust plume. He could aim for the turret ring the weak point with surgical precision from 3 kilometers away. This was the ingenuity of the American approach. They accepted that they couldn't build a vehicle with enough armor to stop every Soviet shell. So, they built a vehicle that ensured the Soviet shell was never fired. But seeing the enemy was only half the equation. You had to kill them. The Bradley was armed with the M242 Bushmaster, a 25mm chain gun. To the Soviets, 25mm sounded pathetic. It was a pebble compared to a tank shell. But the Americans understood the lethality of precision. The Bushmaster didn't need to blow up the tank to kill it. It fired depleted uranium armor-piercing rounds at 200 rounds per minute. The American doctrine was ruthless. Blind them, then kill them. The Bradley gunners were trained to rake the enemy tanks with chain gun fire. The rounds would shatter the fragile glass of the Soviet optics, snap the radio antennas, and detonate the reactive armor boxes on the outside of the tank. Before the Soviet tank commander even knew he was under attack, he was blind, deaf, and defenseless. And then came the hammer. Mounted on the side of the turret was the TOW launcher tube, launched, optically tracked, wire-guided. The Soviets knew the TOW, but they didn't understand how it was integrated into the Bradley. In a Soviet BMP, firing a missile was a clumsy process. The gunner often had to load it manually or guide it with a joystick that was separate from his main sight. In the Bradley, it was seamless. The gunner kept his crosshairs on the heat signature in his thermal sight. The computer did the rest. The missile flew down the line of sight. The genius of the Bradley was not in any single component, but in the synthesis of them all. It was the first true infantry fighting vehicle that was designed to hunt. It wasn't a taxi that fought in self-defense. It was a predator that carried a squad of infantry as a bonus. The Americans had built a system of systems. While the Soviet factory lines were churning out steel giants based on the lessons of World War II, the American labs were building computers based on the promise of the microchip era. The result was a disparity that no amount of courage could bridge. The American crews in the Bradleys jokingly called their thermal sights the Eye of Sauron. They could see everything. And as the ground war began, this technological secret hidden in plain sight within a vehicle everyone thought was a failure was unleashed. The Americans weren't just driving into the desert. They were walking into a dark room wearing night vision goggles, carrying a machine gun, while their opponent was blindfolded and holding a knife. The outcome wasn't a battle. It was a revelation of a new age of warfare. The moment of truth did not happen on the battlefield. It happened in a sterile, fluorescent-lit briefing room in Moscow, months after the ceasefire had been signed. The Soviet General Staff had finally received the comprehensive after-action report, compiled from their own intelligence sources and open-source Western media. For months, they had been dreading the numbers. They knew the Iraqi army had been defeated. They knew it was bad. But they were expecting a conventional defeat, a story of air superiority and heavy tank maneuvers. Then, they turned the page to the section titled Armored Vehicle Kills by Platform. The room went silent. The data was stark, undeniable, and impossible. According to the initial battlefield tallies, the M2 Bradley, the tall, thin-skinned, failed troop carrier, had destroyed more Iraqi armored vehicles than the M1 Abrams main battle tank. This was the shock that stopped the hearts of the generals. It was a statistical impossibility in their worldview. The M1 Abrams was the gladiator, the Bradley was the water boy, and yet the water boy had killed the lion. The report detailed the specific engagement at the Battle of 73 Easting. It described how Bradley crews, using their superior thermals, had spotted Iraqi formations long before the Abrams tanks could even maneuver into position. The Bradleys, aggressive and seeing clearly in the dark, had engaged immediately. They fired Tau missiles at the T-72 tanks from 3,000 meters. Hit, detonation, turret toss. They switched to the 25mm chain gun and shredded the BMPs. Hit, fire, catastrophe. By the time the heavy M1 Abrams tanks arrived to save them, the Bradleys had already cleared half the field. The Soviet generals stared at the photographs attached to the file. They saw T-72 tanks, the pinnacle of Soviet export armor. The tank designed to rush the Rhine reduced to burning scrap by a wire-guided missile fired from a glorified taxi. The realization was nauseating. The shock wasn't just about the loss of hardware, it was the total invalidation of their investment. They had spent billions of rubles building a fleet of 50,000 tanks. They had sacrificed their national economy to build an iron wall. And the Americans had just proved that a 25mm gun and a glass box of sensors could dismantle that wall in a single night. The interrogation transcripts of captured Iraqi officers sealed the verdict. One commander, a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War, was quoted in the report, "We could not fight them. We could not see them. We fired at flashes. But they fired at us like they were standing next to us. The vehicle with the high turret. It is the devil." The devil was the Bradley. This revelation triggered a wave of panic in the Soviet military-industrial complex. The futile response began almost immediately. Design bureaus were ordered to immediately upgrade the optics of the T-72 and T-80 tanks. They were told to install thermal imagers. "Copy the Americans!" shouted the politicians. But this demand only exposed the depth of the tragedy. The Soviet Union didn't have the microchips. They didn't have the manufacturing precision to build high-quality thermal sensors in mass quantities. They could build a few prototypes by hand, but they couldn't outfit an army. It was the MiG-25 moment of the ground war. Years prior, when a Soviet pilot defected with a MiG-25 Foxbat, the Americans discovered it was made of steel and used vacuum tubes. It was a brute force solution to a high-tech problem. Now, looking at the Bradley, the Soviets realized they couldn't brute force a thermal sight. You can't weld more steel to solve a blindness problem. They tried to develop jamming systems for the Tau missiles, the Stora active protection system. It was a desperate attempt to use infrared dazzlers to confuse the missile's guidance. It was clever, but it was a patch. It didn't solve the fundamental problem. The Americans could see, and the Soviets could not. The shock deepened when they analyzed the survivability of the Bradley. They had assumed that once a Bradley was hit, it would fold. But the American spore liners, Kevlar blankets inside the vehicle, and the swift fire suppression systems meant that even when Bradleys were hit, the crews often survived. The Soviet BMPs, by contrast, were death traps. When hit, the fuel tanks in the rear doors exploded, incinerating the infantry inside. The contrast was humiliating. The Americans valued their crews and gave them the tools to survive and kill from a distance. The Soviets treated their crews as disposable components of a mass attack machine. As the meeting adjourned, the generals understood that the balance of power hadn't just shifted, it had evaporated. The thousands of tanks parking in the depots of East Germany were now obsolete. They were blind dinosaurs waiting for a meteor. The M2 Bradley, the vehicle they had laughed at, the vehicle the American press had ridiculed, had just single-handedly retired the Soviet doctrine of armored warfare. The mystery was solved. There was no ghost, there was no magic laser, there was just a better camera, a better computer, and a better philosophy. And for the Soviet Union, staring down the barrel of its own economic collapse, that was the most terrifying truth of all. The war ended as quickly as it had begun. 100 hours of ground combat. That was all it took to dismantle the fourth largest army in the world, and, by proxy, the military reputation of the Soviet Union. As the smoke drifted away from the highway of death, the final tally was compiled. It was a ledger of destruction that would be studied in war colleges from West Point to Moscow for the next 3 decades. The statistic that haunted the Russian generals, the killer statistic, was finally etched into history. During the course of the conflict, the M2 Bradley fighting vehicle was credited with destroying more Iraqi armored vehicles than the M1 Abrams main battle tank. Let that sink in. A vehicle designed to carry infantry, a vehicle with armor so thin it could be pierced by a heavy machine gun, had out-hunted the premier tank of the Western world. This wasn't just a surprising number, it was a paradigm shift. It proved that in the modern age, seeing is more lethal than surviving. The Bradley didn't need to take a hit because it ensured the enemy never got the chance to pull the trigger. The first look, first shot, first kill doctrine had moved from a theoretical slogan to a grim reality. The impact of this realization on the Soviet Union was catastrophic. For 40 years, the Cold War had been a contest of industrial might. The Soviets measured power in tons of steel. They built thousands of tanks, thousands of planes, and thousands of missiles. Their entire economy was geared toward heavy industry, the ability to churn out metal faster than the West. But the Bradley proved that the era of heavy metal was over. The era of silicon had begun. The generals in Moscow looked at their production lines. They saw vast factories in the Urals designed to cast turret rings and weld hulls, but they didn't see clean rooms. They didn't see semiconductor fabrication plants. They realized with a sinking heart that they could not copy the M2 Bradley. They could copy the shape, they could mount a gun, they could bolt on a missile launcher, but they could not replicate the thermal sights, the laser rangefinders, and the fire control computers. Those technologies required a sophisticated electronics industry that the Soviet command economy, with its rigid quotas and lack of innovation, had failed to foster. The defeat in the desert was the final nail in the coffin of the Soviet military myth. It stripped away the fear. NATO commanders, who had spent sleepless nights worrying about the red steamroller rushing through the Fulda Gap, suddenly slept soundly. They knew now that the steamroller was blind. The legacy of this mystery extends far beyond 1991. The Bradley shock forced every major military power to rethink its armored vehicles. The definition of an infantry fighting vehicle changed overnight. It was no longer just a battle taxi. It was now expected to be a tank killer. We see the echoes of this today. Modern Russian designs, like the BMP-3 and the T-90 tank, are desperate attempts to catch up to the standards set by the Bradley in 1991. They are covered in cameras, they are bristling with sensors. But even now, decades later, the integration of these systems often lags behind the Western standard. The M2 Bradley, the ugly duckling of the Pentagon, vindicated its designers. It proved that the critics who obsessed over armor thickness were fighting the last war. The designers who obsessed over situational awareness were fighting the future war. In a twist of irony, the vehicle that was once called a rolling coffin became one of the most feared systems on the battlefield. It didn't survive because it was invincible. It survived because it was intelligent. The desert wind blows over the rusted hulks of T-72 tanks that still litter the Iraqi border, half buried in the shifting sands. They are monuments to a dead empire. In 1991, the Soviet generals looked at these burning wrecks, and saw more than just a lost ally. They saw their own obsolescence. They realized that while they were perfecting the hammer, the Americans had invented the scalpel. The mystery of the ghost that destroyed the Republican Guard was never supernatural. It was the terrifying clarity of technology. The Cold War didn't end with a nuclear bang. It ended in the dark, with a silent, unseen missile fired from a vehicle that shouldn't have been able to win against a tank that shouldn't have been able to lose. And in that flash of fire, the Soviet Union saw the future. And they were not in it.